Trey Carter, a young cryptocurrency and blockchain millionaire with a bold rock-style personality, boarded a private jet from the U.S. to Dubai, expecting to enjoy tranquility and luxury. But what happened mid-flight changed everything. You won't believe the dramatic and unexpected events that unfolded. Stay until the end to uncover the full story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means the world to us. Trey Carter leaned back into the soft leather seat of the private jet's first-class cabin. He wore reflective blue-tinted sunglasses, a stylish black leather jacket draped over his shoulders, and a silver chain swaying lightly around his neck. Trey's look was anything but typical for a businessman. Instead of the usual suit and tie, he resembled a rock star fresh off the stage from a sold-out performance. Trey scrolled through his phone, reviewing his playlist. Classic rock tunes from bands like Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith played through his wireless earbuds. This trip, he thought, was a well-deserved reward. After securing a series of major deals in the cryptocurrency space and building a thriving financial empire from scratch, Trey finally allowed himself to step away from the relentless grind of work. Dubai, a city of unparalleled luxury and limitless possibilities, was his destination this time. While he was scheduled to attend a major tech conference there, Trey had decided to treat himself to a few days of indulgence at the Burj Al Arab Hotel, where he had booked a ridiculously expensive penthouse suite. The private jet offered the comfort of a five-star hotel soaring through the skies. Gentle ambient lighting illuminated the cabin, Italian leather seats were arranged spaciously, and the attentive flight crew catered to every need. A glass of amber-colored cocktail shimmered in Trey's hand as a flight attendant approached him with a polite bow. "Mr. Carter, is there anything else you need?" she asked sweetly. "No, thank you," Trey replied with a charming smile. "You've done an excellent job. But maybe I'll ask for a whiskey later, if it's not too much trouble." "We're always happy to assist you," the flight attendant replied, her professional smile unwavering in the face of Trey's natural charisma. Trey raised his cocktail glass, playfully toasting his own reflection in the jet's window. "To Dubai," he murmured, his eyes gazing at the endless blue sky beyond. The jet began taxiing down the runway, the gentle roar of the engines sending a faint vibration through the cabin. Trey let his body relax, embracing the familiar excitement of a long-haul flight. What he didn't know, however, was that the next few hours would turn into one of the most unforgettable experiences of his life, but not in the way he had hoped. When the plane stabilized at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and the other passengers seemed to settle into relaxation. Most of them were accomplished individuals, entrepreneurs, celebrities, or members of the upper echelons of society. Trey glanced briefly at a few of them but didn't pay much attention. He was used to the occasional curious glances or whispered comments whenever people recognized who he was. Trey shrugged off his leather jacket, leaned back into his seat, and began jotting down some new ideas for the cryptocurrency project he was working on. But less than an hour later, the calm was interrupted by a voice coming over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hale. We are currently cruising at an altitude of 31,500 feet over international airspace. We are approximately 6.5 hours away from Dubai. The weather is clear, and the journey should remain smooth. If you require any assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out to our flight crew." The captain's voice was steady and confident, but to Trey, it didn't quite feel reassuring. There was something about the tone of faint coldness, as if he were addressing a crowd he didn't really care for. Trey brushed off the thought and refocused on his work. About 30 minutes later, Captain Hale unexpectedly appeared in the cabin. He was a tall, middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair neatly combed back and wearing a crisp pilot's uniform. He walked down the aisle, greeting passengers with a distant smile that felt more formal than warm. When Hale reached Trey's seat, his gaze lingered slightly longer than usual. Trey could feel the captain's eyes scanning him from the leather jacket, to the tattoos peeking out from his wrist, to the silver chain draped around his neck. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Hale paused, clearly unsure or uninterested in remembering Trey's name. "Trey Carter," Trey replied with a faint smirk. "And yes, everything is great. Thanks for asking." Captain Hale nodded, but instead of moving on, he lingered a moment longer, his eyes subtly probing. Trey could feel the tension in the air beginning to rise. "I just want to make sure everyone on this flight is comfortable and safe," Hale said, his tone casual but carrying an undertone that was harder to read. "Well, I assume I'm part of that everyone right, Trey replied, keeping his voice light but unable to hide the edge in his words. Hale pressed his lips together and nodded again. Of course, Mr. Carter. We always ensure that our customers belong here. Trey frowned. What exactly do you mean by that? Nothing at all, Hale said before walking away, leaving Trey without a chance to say anything further. Trey watched as the captain disappeared back into the cockpit. A feeling of unease crept over him. He was used to judgmental looks and veiled comments from people who couldn't understand or accept his success, a black man with a distinct, unconventional style. But this felt like something more than the usual suspicion. Trying to shake it off, Trey returned to his playlist and work. But the sense of uneasiness lingered in the back of his mind, like a small voice warning him that something was about to happen. Hours passed in relative peace, but the tension in the air never truly dissipated. Trey closed his eyes to catch a quick nap, hoping to push away the negative thoughts. When he woke up, everything had changed. The intercom crackled to life again, snapping Trey out of his light sleep. He glanced out the window to see thick darkness enveloping the sky, with only faint starlight reflecting off the plane's wing. The cabin was still quiet, the steady hum of the engines lulling most passengers into a relaxed state. But Trey didn't feel relaxed at all. As he stretched his arms, Captain Hale suddenly emerged into the cabin. This time, the friendly pretense was gone. His expression was icy, his eyes filled with suspicion, and his commanding presence exuded a palpable sense of intimidation that made the atmosphere immediately tense. Hale walked down the aisle, his gaze fixed on Trey. Nearby passengers looked up, noticing the captain's unexpected presence. A few exchanged worried glances, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Stopping in front of Trey's seat, Hale crossed his arms over his chest and spoke in a steady but firm voice. Mr. Carter, I need to ask you a few questions. Trey raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. I'm not sure what we need to discuss, but go ahead. Hale leaned in closer, lowering himself to meet Trey's eye level. I need you to explain why you're on this flight. Trey froze for a moment, taken aback by the audacity of the question. He removed his earbuds, set them down on the table in front of him, and locked eyes with Hale. Why I'm here, Trey repeated, his tone laced with faint sarcasm. I booked the flight. I paid for it. I think that makes it pretty clear, doesn't it? Hale didn't break eye contact, his lips pressed into a thin line. I just want to ensure that everyone on this flight belongs here. Trey leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady and cold. What exactly are you implying, Captain? That I don't belong here? Why? Because I'm not wearing a suit. Because I don't look like your idea of a traditional CEO. Or because I'm black. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. Passengers nearby began craning their necks to listen, and a few even turned around completely to watch the interaction. Trey could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him, but he stayed composed, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. Trey watched as the captain disappeared back into the cockpit. A feeling of unease crept over him. He was used to judgmental looks and veiled comments from people who couldn't understand or accept his success, a black man with a distinct, unconventional style. But this felt like something more than the usual suspicion. Trying to shake it off, Trey returned to his playlist and work. But the sense of uneasiness lingered in the back of his mind, like a small voice warning him that something was about to happen. Hours passed in relative peace, but the tension in the air never truly dissipated. Trey closed his eyes to catch a quick nap, hoping to push away the negative thoughts. When he woke up, everything had changed. The intercom crackled to life again, snapping Trey out of his light sleep. He glanced out the window to see thick darkness enveloping the sky, with only faint starlight reflecting off the plane's wing. The cabin was still quiet, the steady hum of the engines lulling most passengers into a relaxed state. But Trey didn't feel relaxed at all. As he stretched his arms, Captain Hale suddenly emerged into the cabin. This time, the friendly pretense was gone. His expression was icy, his eyes filled with suspicion, and his commanding presence exuded a palpable sense of intimidation that made the atmosphere immediately tense. Hale walked down the aisle, his gaze fixed on Trey. Nearby passengers looked up, noticing the captain's unexpected presence. A few exchanged worried glances, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Stopping in front of Trey's seat, Hale crossed his arms over his chest and spoke in a steady but firm voice. Mr. Carter, I need to ask you a few questions. Trey raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. I'm not sure what we need to discuss, but go ahead. Hale leaned in closer, lowering himself to meet Trey's eye level. I need you to explain why you're on this flight. Trey froze for a moment, taken aback by the audacity of the question. He removed his earbuds, set them down on the table in front of him, and locked eyes with Hale. Why I'm here, Trey repeated, his tone laced with faint sarcasm. I booked the flight. I paid for it. I think that makes it pretty clear, doesn't it? Hale didn't break eye contact, his lips pressed into a thin line. I just want to ensure that everyone on this flight belongs here. Trey leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady and cold. What exactly are you implying, Captain? That I don't belong here. Why? Because I'm not wearing a suit. Because I don't look like your idea of a traditional CEO. Or because I'm black. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. Passengers nearby began craning their necks to listen, and a few even turned around completely to watch the interaction. Trey could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him, but he stayed composed, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. Hale shook his head, but the faint smile on his lips looked almost mocking. Don't misunderstand me, Mr. Carter. We simply want to ensure the safety of all our passengers. Sometimes people try to exploit the system to gain access to places they don't belong. I'm just doing my job. And your job, Trey replied, his voice low and steady, is to sit in the cockpit and fly the plane, not to interrogate passengers without a valid reason. Hale straightened up, his expression as cold as ice. Don't worry, Mr. Carter. We'll see if your words match the reality. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Trey with a sharp sense of unease. As Hale returned to the cockpit, Trey noticed that the passengers nearby had started whispering to each other. A middle-aged woman sitting ahead of him turned around, her face openly curious. A young businessman wearing glasses pretended to focus on his laptop screen, but Trey could see him sneaking glances in his direction. Trey was no stranger to these kinds of looks. As a young black entrepreneur with an unconventional style, he was accustomed to being judged based on his appearance. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just the usual suspicion. It was outright hostility. A young flight attendant approached him, clearly trying to reassure him. I'm sorry, sir, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Our captain is very thorough. Perhaps he's just a little concerned about security. Trey smirked, shaking his head. Concerned about security? Or concerned about me? The flight attendant didn't respond, her anxious expression speaking volumes. Trey sighed and waved her off, signaling that he didn't want to continue the conversation. Less than 30 minutes later, the intercom crackled again. This time, Captain Hale's voice was no longer calm and composed. Mr. Trey Carter, his voice rang out, curt and commanding. Please remain seated. I will be with you shortly. Trey could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin turning toward him. He sat up straight, his hands resting firmly on the armrests, his body ready for whatever was about to unfold. Within less than a minute, Hale emerged from the cockpit, flanked by two flight attendants. Their faces betrayed nervousness, but Hale himself appeared rigid and more determined than ever. He walked straight up to Trey, stopping right in front of his seat. Mr. Carter, Hale said coldly, I need you to present documentation proving your identity and your reason for being on this flight. Trey stared at him, completely taken aback. Are you kidding me? I already provided my documents when I booked the ticket, when I boarded the plane, and when I passed through security. What more do you want? This is a high-end private flight, Hale replied, his sharp eyes cutting into Trey. And I have the authority to ensure that everyone on this flight is here legally. If you have nothing to hide, then showing your documents shouldn't be a problem, right? Trey stood up, slowly but deliberately. He was taller than Hale, and his gaze radiated a calm confidence that was impossible to shake. Listen here, buddy, Trey said, his voice low and firm. I have nothing to hide, and I've followed all the proper procedures. But the way you're acting makes it clear you're targeting me. If you've got an issue with me, why don't you just come out and say it? Captain Hale clenched his fists, his face flushing red with anger. I don't have to explain anything to you, he snarled. I am the captain of this flight, and I have the authority to decide who is allowed to be here. Oh, really? So, what's your plan? Trey asked, raising an eyebrow. Throw me off the plane in the middle of the sky. A few passengers chuckled quietly, but Hale didn't find it amusing. He turned to the flight attendants and barked, prepare for an emergency landing. We'll deal with this situation immediately." Not long after, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, for safety reasons, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." The cabin descended into chaos. Passengers exchanged nervous glances while Trey felt anger boiling inside him. He knew he had done nothing wrong. This wasn't about safety, this was about prejudice. As the plane began to descend, Trey gripped the armrests tightly, trying to stay composed. He realized that the situation had shifted from uncomfortable to outright dangerous, but he had no intention of letting Captain Hale win. The private jet landed at a small airport in the middle of a remote area in the Middle East. The dim lights along the runway reflected off the sleek surface of the aircraft. Trey looked out the window and saw no signs of a major city. This wasn't the international airport in Dubai he had expected, and the realization only made his anger intensify. As the plane rolled to a stop at the parking area, a young flight attendant approached Trey's seat nervously. She tried to smile, but her unease was evident. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, avoiding eye contact, "the captain has requested that you disembark here." Trey narrowed his eyes at her, then glanced toward the cockpit, where the door was firmly shut. Slowly, he stood up, placing his earbuds and phone aside before turning to face her. "He requested," Trey said, his voice low and icy. "Or did he order? Because from what I can see, this doesn't feel like much of a choice." The flight attendant pressed her lips together, her eyes filled with regret, but she said nothing further. Trey turned his gaze to the other passengers. Some were staring at him intently, while a few others quickly looked away when his eyes met theirs. No one spoke up to defend him. "So that's it," Trey said loudly, addressing everyone in the cabin. "None of you see anything wrong with this? None of you think it's unjust to throw me off this plane in the middle of nowhere just because the captain doesn't like me?" Silence blanketed the cabin. Trey shook his head, feeling the cold indifference and apathy hanging in the air. He sighed, picked up his leather jacket and bag, and stepped into the aisle. Captain Hale was waiting at the door of the aircraft, his expression cold and his eyes sharp like knives. "Thank you for your cooperation," Mr. Carter, Hale said with a mocking tone. "Our flight will now continue without any further disruptions." Trey stood inches away from him, meeting his gaze. "You think this is over, don't you?" Trey said quietly but firmly. "You're going to pay for this. I promise you." Hale smirked and waved dismissively, as if eager to be rid of him. "Get off the plane now, before I call security." The door to the plane shut with a loud clang the moment Trey stepped onto the tarmac. The jet began to taxi away, the engines roaring as it prepared to take off, leaving Trey standing alone in the vast emptiness of the remote airfield. Trey looked around. This airport was unlike anything he'd ever seen: small, desolate, and completely surrounded by darkness. There was no main terminal, just a small metal shack sitting in a far corner. No vehicles, no people. He pulled his jacket tighter over his shoulders and gripped his bag firmly. The anger from his confrontation on the plane had now given way to an entirely different feeling: helplessness and danger. Trey made his way toward the shack, his boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the shack contained nothing more than a wooden table, a single chair, and an old ceiling fan spinning lazily. A middle-aged man, who appeared to be an airport worker, was sitting there reading a newspaper. Looking up, the man stared at Trey in surprise. "What are you doing here at this hour?" he asked in English, his accent thick and unfamiliar. Trey set his bag down on the table. "I just got kicked off a private jet. The captain decided I didn't belong there." The man raised his eyebrows, clearly struggling to believe what he'd just heard. "What? Are you serious? Nobody gets left here. This is just a cargo transit airport." "Well, it seems I'm the exception," Trey replied, a wry smile forming on his lips. "Do you have a phone, or any way I can contact someone outside of here?" The man shook his head, glancing down at the outdated phone on the table. "The lines here don't work reliably. You could wait until morning when the shift workers arrive. But for now, I can't help you." With no other options, Trey decided to find a spot to rest for the night in the airport area. He sat down against a wall, placing his bag beside him, trying to stay alert. Outside, the sound of crickets blended with the rustling wind through the trees. Around midnight, the rumble of a truck engine echoed from a distance. Trey looked up to see a small truck pulling up outside the shack. A group of locals climbed out of the vehicle. They were cargo transport workers, their appearance simple but friendly. A young man, likely in his late 20s or early 30s, approached Trey. "Are you okay?" he asked in English, his accent slightly broken. Trey offered a faint smile. "Not really. I was just abandoned here. Do you have any way to help me contact someone?" The man, who introduced himself as Amir, nodded. "Phones here are hard to use, but if you want, we can take you to the village. There's better reception there." Trey hesitated for a moment. This wasn't the ideal solution, but at least it was better than sitting in the dark waiting in vain. "Thank you. I'd really appreciate your help." Amir and his group of friends drove Trey to their village in a small truck. It was a modest but cozy place, with little wooden houses clustered together and the faint glow of oil lamps flickering in the darkness. The villagers, upon hearing Trey's story, expressed outrage at the actions of the captain. One family invited Trey to stay the night. They provided him with food, water, and helped him connect to the outside world using an old satellite phone. "You're a lucky man," Amir said as he sat beside Trey. "Not many people around here would be willing to help, but we couldn't just stand by and leave you stranded like that." Trey was deeply moved by their kindness. These strangers, though they had so little, were willing to share everything they had to help him. "Thank you," Trey said sincerely, his eyes reflecting gratitude. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." The next morning, Trey used the satellite phone to call Kevin, his manager in the U.S. When Kevin heard the story, his reaction was immediate and loud. "They did what?" "Trey, do you have any idea how big of a deal this is? We're going to make that airline pay for this." "Now's not the time to get angry," Trey said, his voice calm but resolute. "I need you to arrange a flight to get me back to the U.S. as soon as possible. After that, we'll deal with this." When Trey ended the call, he felt a wave of determination rise within him. The confrontation with Captain Hale had become personal, not just because of the humiliation Trey had endured, but because he knew that if he didn't take a stand, others could become victims too. Trey turned back to Amir and his family. "Thank you all for saving me. I owe you more than I can ever repay. But I promise you, no one will ever have to go through this again." Trey Carter sat on a regular commercial flight, gazing out the window at the bright skies as the plane touched down in Los Angeles. His return journey was neither luxurious nor peaceful, unlike how it had begun. But it carried something far more significant: a burning determination. It had taken Trey nearly 2 days to get back to the U.S. Thanks to the help of Amir and the remote village community, they not only helped him reconnect with the outside world, but also reminded him of the power of solidarity and kindness. But now Trey was back with a clear mission to hold Captain Hale and the airline accountable for what they had done. As Trey stepped out of the airport, the bright sunlight beamed down on his face, but his mind was laser-focused. Kevin, his manager, was already waiting just outside the doors. "You okay?" Kevin asked, his eyes scanning Trey from head to toe. "Listen, I've heard everything. This is insane, Trey. That airline and that captain are going to pay for this." Trey gave a faint smile, though the exhaustion was still evident on his face. "I'm fine, Kev. But this is far from over. We need a plan, and I want everyone to know about this." Once he got home, Trey immediately called for an emergency meeting with his management team and legal counsel. In the meeting room, Kevin and his team had already prepared all the necessary materials, including a large screen displaying social media posts that had started circulating. "Look at this," Kevin said, pointing at the screen. "Some passengers on the flight recorded the captain confronting you. One of them uploaded the video online, and it's going viral. Within 24 hours, the hashtag #JusticeForTrey has become a trending topic on Twitter and Instagram. People are losing their minds over this." Trey leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the video playing on the screen. It showed the moment Captain Hale pointed his finger at him, speaking with a tone full of disdain and prejudice, while Trey stood his ground, unflinching. "This is good," Trey said after a moment of silence. "The more people know about this, the more pressure they'll face. But we can't just stop at social media. I want to take them to court. They need to pay for what they did, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever been treated unfairly like this." One of the lawyers, a middle-aged woman named Marissa, nodded. "Trey, we have a solid case for a lawsuit. Captain Hale's actions weren't just discriminatory, they were reckless and endangered the safety of passengers. We'll sue both him and the airline for abuse of authority and endangerment." "Do it," Trey said, his voice low but firm. While the legal team began gathering evidence and preparing the case, Trey took to social media to tell his story. He recorded a short video, appearing in a simple, unpretentious way: black t-shirt, slightly messy hair, and eyes filled with resolve. "Hey everyone," Trey began, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Trey Carter, and I've just experienced something I never thought would happen to me, something that no one should ever have to go through." He recounted the entire ordeal, from how Captain Hale interrogated him on the plane, to how he abused his authority to force Trey off the flight and abandon him in a remote location. He emphasized that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a systemic problem: discrimination that persisted in spaces that should have been equal and professional. "This isn't just my story," Trey said, his eyes locking directly with the camera. "This is the story of millions of people who've been judged for the color of their skin, their appearance, or the way they live their lives. And I'm not going to let this slide. I'm going to fight not just for myself, but for all of us." The video quickly garnered millions of views. Comments poured in from across the world, expressing both support for Trey and outrage at Captain Hale's actions. Hashtags like "Justice for Trey," "Say No to Discrimination," and "Fly with Dignity" spread rapidly across social media platforms. The media attention put the airline in a defensive position. Within just a few days, news outlets and TV programs began covering the incident, demanding explanations from the airline. At first, the airline issued a vague statement, claiming that there had been a misunderstanding on the flight and that they would investigate the matter, but this only fueled public anger. The next day, Trey appeared in a live television interview, where he shared his story in greater detail. He didn't hesitate to call out Captain Hale and the airline system that enabled such discriminatory behavior. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Trey said, his gaze sharp. "This was a deliberate act, driven by prejudice and abuse of power. And if they think I'm going to let this slide, they're wrong." The public and media pressure forced the airline to issue a second statement. This time, they announced that Captain Hale had been suspended from duty and promised full cooperation in the investigation. But Trey knew this wasn't enough. Suspending Hale wasn't justice. As the lawsuit moved closer to trial, Trey's legal team continued gathering evidence. They reached out to other passengers on the flight, seeking testimonies and additional video footage. Some passengers, initially hesitant to get involved, ultimately agreed to come forward after seeing the widespread attention the case had garnered. One of the witnesses, a young businessman who had been sitting near Trey on the plane, recounted how he felt deeply disturbed by how Captain Hale had treated Trey. "He singled Trey out from the very beginning," the witness said. "I couldn't believe something like that could happen on a private flight. It was clearly discriminatory behavior." At the same time, Trey's lawyer, Marissa, uncovered a critical piece of information: Captain Hale had been accused of discriminatory conduct in the past, but those incidents had either been covered up or handled internally. This added further weight to the argument that Hale's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a repeated pattern. In the weeks that followed, Trey's lawsuit became a symbol of the fight against discrimination in the airline industry. Artists, activists, and celebrities spoke out in support of Trey on social media, turning his story into a global movement. Despite being busy with legal work, Trey made time to inspire his supporters. He appeared on forums, participated in conferences, and used his story to call for systemic change. "This isn't just about me," he said during one of his speeches. "This is about all of us, about the right to be treated fairly and with dignity, no matter who you are, where you come from, or what you look like." The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and members of the public had gathered to witness the trial. Trey Carter's lawsuit had become an international event, a symbol of the fight against discrimination and abuse of power in the airline industry. Trey walked into the courtroom wearing a dark suit, still maintaining his signature style with a silver chain draped over his shirt. His gaze was firm, and though he looked slightly tired from weeks of preparation, he knew he was doing the right thing. Behind him was his lawyer, Marissa, and his legal team, all ready for the battle ahead. On the other side of the courtroom, Captain Hale sat next to the airline's legal team. He looked stiff, his face tense but still carrying a hint of his usual arrogance. Marissa began the proceedings with a powerful opening statement. She detailed the events on the flight, from Captain Hale's baseless questioning of Trey to his decision to force Trey off the plane and leave him stranded at a remote airport. "This isn't just about discrimination," Marissa emphasized, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "This is about a deliberate abuse of power, an act that endangered the safety and dignity of a passenger simply because he didn't fit the captain's prejudiced expectations." The airline's legal team attempted to defend Captain Hale, claiming that his actions were for security reasons and that Trey had acted suspiciously, but Marissa swiftly dismantled their argument. Security reasons, Marissa asked, her voice sharp as a blade. There is no evidence whatsoever that Trey Carter posed a security threat to the flight. The only thing Captain Hale relied on to make his judgment was Mr. Carter's appearance and style. One by one, witnesses took the stand to testify. A passenger who had been sitting near Trey on the flight recounted how it was clear that Captain Hale had targeted Trey from the moment he entered the cabin. It was obvious, the witness said. The captain didn't question anyone else. He zeroed in on Trey immediately. I couldn't believe something like that could happen on a private flight. He didn't question any of the other passengers, the witness said. Only Trey, and the way he spoke. It was as if he had already decided Trey didn't belong there. The next witness was a flight attendant. She was young and visibly nervous as she took the stand, but after some reassurance, she recounted what she had witnessed. Captain Hale. He called Trey a potential threat while in the cockpit, she said, her voice trembling. But Trey didn't do anything wrong. He was very polite. I don't understand why he treated him that way. The turning point came when a video recorded by a passenger was played for the jury. In the video, Captain Hale could clearly be seen displaying hostility toward Trey, his cold voice stating, "People like you don't belong here." The courtroom fell nearly silent as the video ended. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, and the airline's legal team scrambled to contain the emotional impact it had clearly left on the room. The defense tried to regain ground. They brought Captain Hale to the stand to defend himself. I acted for the safety of the passengers, Hale said, his tone flat. Trey Carter didn't meet the standards of what I consider a typical passenger for a private flight. I was just doing my job. But when Marissa stood to cross-examine him, Hale began to falter. Do you have any evidence that Trey Carter posed a threat to the flight? Marissa asked. No. Not exactly, Hale stammered. Then what made you decide he didn't belong on the flight? Hale remained silent, his eyes avoiding contact. Marissa pressed on, her voice growing stronger. Was it the color of his skin, his style, or your own prejudice about who deserves to be on a private flight like this? There was no response. Marissa's question hung in the air, leaving a heavy silence in the courtroom. Trey's legal team then presented a bombshell piece of evidence, an internal airline report revealing that Captain Hale had previously been accused of discriminatory behavior. This wasn't the first time he did this, Marissa declared. The airline was fully aware of his actions but chose to do nothing, and that decision led directly to this incident. They are just as responsible. After several days of deliberation, the jury delivered their final verdict. They found both the airline and Captain Hale guilty of discrimination, abuse of power, and unlawful endangerment. The airline was ordered to pay a substantial settlement to Trey Carter and implement sweeping reforms to their hiring and training policies to combat discrimination. Captain Hale was permanently stripped of his pilot's license and faced criminal charges for his actions. As Trey stepped out of the courtroom, he was met by hundreds of supporters cheering loudly. Kevin stood beside him, giving him a proud pat on the shoulder. We did it, Kevin said. But this is just the beginning. Trey smiled, looking out at the crowd. That's right. This is the start of something bigger. Trey later hosted a live speech to thank everyone who had supported him. This isn't just my victory, he said. This is a victory for all of us. Justice isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for. I hope this story serves as a reminder that no one has the right to judge you just because you're different. A month later, Trey stood on the rooftop of the Burj Al Arab in Dubai, sipping a cocktail as he watched the sun rise over the desert. The vacation he had missed was finally happening, but this time with a true sense of peace. He felt a deep sense of relief knowing he had not only fought for himself but also created positive change for so many others. The ring of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Kevin. Good news, Kevin said on the other end. Several other airlines want to partner with you to run campaigns raising awareness about discrimination. Trey smiled, his eyes lighting up. Good. It's time to make the airline industry a place where everyone is treated with respect. As the sun rose higher, Trey knew his fight wasn't over. But he was ready. Thank you for following this powerful story. This isn't just about Trey Carter, it's a reminder that each of us has the power to stand up against injustice and create meaningful change. If this story inspired you, please hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support drives us to keep bringing you impactful stories. Let us know where you're watching from.